Hello my friends, I hope you're doing well today. I am today doing very well. Today is Wednesday, which is my rest day. It's also my last week of classes, which is really exciting. One of the reasons I am feeling so much better is not only that it is my last week of classes of university, but also because I took my own advice from last week's video and I went to the rock climbing gym on Saturday and I feel amazing because I did that. I really highly recommend exercise if you have been going through a hard time. It really does wonders to lift your spirits. Yeah, I just wanted to take this opportunity to tell you guys a little bit about all of my final assignments, because although they are really stressful and a lot of work, they're also super fun and they're my final assignments ever of my university degree and I'm really excited to get onto all of them. So I thought I would just tell you what kind of stuff I'm going to be working on for the next 2 months. So to begin with, I'm gonna do it in order of when I have to submit each of these assignments, but I'm going to save the dissertation for last, even though it is the penultimate assignment that I have to submit. So to begin with, the assignment that I have to work on next week is to do with Marcus Aurelius Meditations. It is for my Good Life in Ancient Philosophy course, and I'm going to be writing on oblivion and death and kind of how the view from above that I discussed in my What Does It Mean to Live a Good Life video, how Marcus utilizes that kind of view from above, the existential view of the universe is always in flux and we just exist in this tiny point in the world, in the universe, and that we are really insignificant. All of that kind of existential writing that he does in the meditations, and kind of what purpose does that serve. And so I'm really excited to get into this topic. I haven't really read the meditations for a few months now, so I'm going to reread it in order to write this essay and also do some secondary reading. Mainly, I think The Inner Citadel by Pierre Hadot and Philosophy as a Way of Life, also by Pierre Hadot. Those are the two recommended readings from my professor, so if you haven't read those, I hear that they're pretty good for kind of secondary literature on Marcus Aurelius. And so yeah, that's gonna be my main occupation for the next week or so. And then after that, I'm going to be working on my dissertation for a few weeks. Meanwhile, also writing about art. So my second assignment, other than my dissertation, will be on what is art and whether art is dead. This is by Arthur C. Danto, who is a pretty famous literary critic, art critic, philosopher. He writes on a lot of different subjects, and his writing on art mainly he was the one who theorized that art is dead, or in other words, that art history is dead after the postmodernism, and namely Andy Warhol and the exhibition on the Brillo boxes, which is basically just Andy Warhol's replication of a very standard object. And it's basically when art becomes indistinguishable from everyday objects, can we really say that it is art anymore? And if it is, does that mean that art has lost its directionality in terms of its progression in a historical way, or is art freed from this rigid structure of certain viewpoints of itself, perspectives of itself? So I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah, I'm basically going to be writing on whether art is dead or not, and whether Danto was right that it is. But yeah, I'm really excited to get deeper into this topic. I don't know so much about it at the moment. I've only attended one lecture, I've read one essay. I've got to read way more and think way more on the topic to approach this essay. So if you guys are interested in talking about art, definitely leave a comment down below and let me know if want to talk about art, because I'm gonna have to be writing on art, and I think that any examples as well that you can think of in the 20th and 21st century of art or artists that do things that we don't standardly think of as art, like Marina Abramović is a really good example of an artist that is really controversial, because I feel like her art is more philosophy than it is art. And there's actually this strange thing about how philosophers like to think when they philosophize about art that art's purpose is philosophy, and that like the ultimate ideal for art is that it becomes philosophy. But obviously that's a really kind of just philosophers being full of themselves, thinking that they're at the center of the world. However, like when I brought this up in my seminar, my lecturer was like, but you know that if you click enough times on Wikipedia on literally anything, you eventually get to philosophy, right? And so maybe philosophy is at the core of everything, and it would be nice to think so, but I don't know. I think it's kind of stuck up. I think that art is art, and we can't really define it, and we shouldn't really keep it in this rigid structure, nor should we think that it dies because it just becomes whatever it wants to be and becomes kind of unleashed from its strict definitions of itself. So I don't know a lot about this, but I'm going to be writing my essay on it in a few weeks. I will be writing an essay on that, so that's very exciting. Then my dissertation deadline will come up, but after that, and I'll get into my dissertation at the end of this video, I will be writing on, for my philosophy and literature class, I'll be writing on why the mythological form is good for philosophy, for communicating philosophy. So like, why do some philosophies take the form of myth? A really great example of a myth in the history of philosophy is Plato's myth of the cave, which is kind of an analogy of his kind of theory of the forms. Not super into Plato's forms and all of that, so I'm not going to get into it, but other really famous myths include Nietzsche's myth of the the camel, the lion, and the boy, I think, which is kind of supposed to represent different periods in conscious mind and how it evolves into like accepting itself and all of that. Like, not an accurate description, don't take my word for it, but the myth that I will be using to like unpack this essay question is going to be Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus. Now, I was going to use this in my dissertation, and I don't think I'm going to anymore, but since I reread it for my dissertation, I thought I would get back into it and use the myth of Sisyphus to unpack this question. And the myth of Sisyphus is one of my favorite myths in the history of philosophy. Basically, for Camus, Sisyphus represents the absurd hero who has to struggle throughout life and push this boulder up a hill. Like in Greek mythology, that was what Sisyphus was cursed to do, to push this huge stone up a hill, roll it up a hill, kind of struggling to do so. And then when he reaches the top, obviously the stone would just roll all the way down, and then he would go down, and he would have to push it back up again. And that's sort of an analogy for Camus of human existence. And he uses the idea of Sisyphus as being kind of content, or at least trying to see the value in his futile mission, kind of as analogous to the human experience and how we should try to find happiness in our futile existence. I'm gonna make a whole video on the myth of Sisyphus after I write that essay, and kind of when I have more time to talk about this, but a really famous line, which is on the cover of this book, is there is but one seriously philosophical problem, and that is suicide. And so Camus' project is basically trying to answer the question of whether life is worth living. And for him, even though life is absurd, it is worth living. And so Sisyphus is used as an example of why, even though his mission and his life is absurd, if we imagine Sisyphus as being happy, doing this absurd, meaningless thing, then we can also be happy. It's kind of a cool myth. I am interested in kind of going back into this for like a third, fourth time and writing an essay on it. So that's what my final essay for philosophy and literature is going to be. It's really exciting. And finally, for my dissertation, which is, okay, it's going well. So as of today, okay, so today is actually exactly 4 weeks from my deadline, which is kind of crazy because my deadline is Wednesday, the 1st of May. My dissertation has evolved a lot over the course of the year that I've spent thinking about it, reading and researching for it, and writing it. At the moment, the writing that I have for it has mainly been just to get the ideas out and try to figure out the structure, but it's just changed a lot. So I really wanted to write on poetry, on why poetry is a good philosophical format, and basically because I wanted to write on T.S. Eliot and the first of the four quartets, which is Burnt Norton. And you probably, if you've watched some of my videos, you probably know that like I am obsessed with this poem. So yes, that was the starting point of my project, and then it kind of evolved a long way from there. The big question that I had to figure out was whether I wanted to take it from the perspective of that philosophy is poetic or that poetry is philosophical, and I decided that I wanted to say that poetry is philosophical. But in order to do that, I had to kind of construct an argument. I had to know like what am I arguing for, what am I arguing against, how do I convince readers. I had to do like obviously a lot of reading, and there were some really interesting sources that I found. Okay, so I started kind of thinking about Plato and the origins of the problem between philosophy and poetry, and this was kind of my starting point, but I felt that I didn't really want to make my whole dissertation about Plato. Like I said, I'm not a huge fan of Plato and his whole project, although it's interesting and everything, and it is the starting point of philosophy in a lot of ways in the Western tradition. This wasn't like super interesting to me, so I kind of put that on the side. I also kind of looked into some contemporary poetics, such as The Language of Inquiry by Lynn Heinian, and Lynn Heinian thinks that poetry is the language of inquiry, and this was a really interesting idea, although I feel like her writing is very based on like analyzing literature and analyzing poetry as opposed to necessarily thinking of it as philosophy. And so while this book was so interesting to kind of get into, I didn't end up reading as much of it as I wanted to, and I also didn't think it was super relevant to my dissertation, so I had to put that on the side as well. I was recommended by my dissertation advisor to read Love's Knowledge, Essays on Philosophy and Literature by Martha Nussbaum. Martha Nussbaum is amazing. She's written so many things. And while, again, this was super interesting and the introduction is especially, like, relevant to me, I didn't end up using this. So, as you can see already, like, these are a lot to get through, and didn't end up being super relevant to me. I was also recommended to read Poetry Language Thought by Martin Heidegger. This was so interesting, but once again, not immediately relevant to me. And also Heidegger's writing is like really difficult, and I didn't think that I wanted to get into the rabbit hole of like unpacking Heidegger for my dissertation, especially because I hadn't studied him formally in any of my classes. I didn't choose to take European philosophy 2, and so I never ended up properly studying Heidegger. I kind of wish I had, but alas, I did not, and so I did not want to get into this, although I may use a quote or two from this book, but nothing super substantial. The 2 or 3 books that I ended up like really gaining a lot from when I read were Poetry and Experience by Archibald MacLeish. This is a book about 4 different poets and kind of the theory of poetry. It's actually really good. It starts with 4 chapters: words as sounds, words as signs, images, and metaphor, and then it unpacks 4 different poets: Dickinson, Yeats, Keats, and Rimbaud, and through unpacking how they use sounds, images, signs, and metaphor, he makes theories about them. And so this was like especially relevant when I thought I was going to be using Dickinson, although MacLeish is like just super interesting theorist when it comes to things about metaphor and just like poetic theory. So I think I still will be using him in my dissertation, although again, not as much as I thought I did when I was reading this book. And another book that was really important to me to read was The Unity of Content and Form in Philosophical Writing by John Stewart. And this was so interesting because his project is really similar to mine. So he kind of talks about how basically there's like this philosophical tradition of the essay and how it's like kind of this hegemony now in contemporary philosophy that everyone writes philosophy in the form of essays, and people kind of undermine the idea that like philosophy could be written in other formats, even though philosophy is written in many different formats. And so he kind of unpacked a lot of these different formats. And yeah, so I definitely quote from the introduction of this book in terms of it's called The Problem of Philosophical Writing. Also, in the first chapter of my dissertation, I quote from Arthur Danto's essay, Philosophy and As of Literature, which is really useful as well for there's like philosophic theory and idea of philosophy and literature and their like philosophy and form. I also quote from Beryl Lang's essay that I can't remember the name of now, but something again to do with philosophy and form and literature and writing and that kind of thing. And then probably the most important theorist that I'm using in my dissertation in terms of just the theory is Jan Zwicky, and she writes a book called Lyric Philosophy. It's a huge book. I'm currently, I don't know, like a third of the way through it. It is huge, but it's kind of written in this format, so like a lot of paper isn't actually being used, and then there are also like moments where she will quote music notation and that kind of thing. So the idea behind this book is really the biggest breakthrough that I had throughout my dissertation research, the ideas that she presents, which is the idea that philosophy can take the form of lyric. And by lyric, she means things that are structurally resident, things that use metaphors and imagery and kind of reflect the structure of experience. And she's basically, her project is very much against the analytic project of philosophy, which is super useful to me because my project is not necessarily directly against the analytic, but it does subvert a lot of the assumptions that analytic philosophy contains. So yeah, I'm currently reading this, even though it's only a month away that my dissertation deadline is. I need to get through this book so that I can fully elaborate on her theory. But okay, enough on theories and books and all of these things. What does my dissertation actually look like, and what kind of argument am I making? And I apologize if this is like super boring to you because I have been talking for a while. The idea is I want to argue that philosophy can take the form of poetry. And the way I'm doing that is I'm starting off by talking about what is philosophy, what on earth is it. I'm using some of the sources that I just mentioned to unpack the idea of like maybe philosophy is form, maybe philosophy is content, maybe philosophy is a combination of form and content, maybe philosophy is Jan Zwicky's idea that it is an effective project. So it's kind of determined by its intention. What does the philosophy try to do to the reader? And that's kind of the idea that I'm taking, which is philosophy is really an attempt to transform, to provoke thought in a reader. The second chapter is all about lyric philosophy and on how and kind of elaborating the theory of lyric philosophy. What does it mean? What does it entail? Can philosophical argument take the form of lyric? Can we kind of step away from the idea that logical argument is the only valid form of argument in philosophy? And the main philosopher that I'm using for this, even though I thought I was going to be using Camus, like I mentioned much earlier, I am actually going to be using Friedrich Nietzsche. My boy Nietzsche is amazing. He is a lyricist by Zwicky's definition. Absolutely he is. His philosophy does not contain very many logical arguments, and yet he is uncontested as a philosopher. Like, no one can dispute the fact that Nietzsche was a philosopher. And so I'm going to be using the opening of this book, Zarathustra, and a bit of the gay science to kind of unpack ideas and kind of bring all of these theoretical claims about the form of philosophy, about the like how it can take the form of lyric and argumentation and transformation and all of this stuff, and I'm going to apply it to Nietzsche. Throughout the first two chapters, I'm going to just be making the argument that philosophy is more open than we think it is. It is not this rigid tradition of argumentation through logic. It is not just this like one thing. It is many, many, many things, including the kind of thing that Nietzsche is doing. And so hopefully if I do that well enough, and if I elaborate and kind of explain Zwicky's theory of lyric in a sufficient way, and it's like convincing and it kind of is coherent and it makes sense, that will kind of flow perfectly into my final chapter, which is going to be all about T.S. Eliot and how in Burnt Norton he is using ideas of lyric. He is using the kind of argumentation that I'm arguing is philosophy. He has a kind of poetry that reflects the structure of experience, and therefore he is doing philosophy. And so that's basically the whole structure of my dissertation and kind of what went into making it. Like I said, I kind of went off track a lot of the time. There were just like many tangential issues that I had to like focus on. So there was this whole thing that I was going to get into about analytic philosophy and how the analytic form of philosophy and why it's wrong, and why the assumption about language and thought and the relationship between language and thought and like all of this stuff that I had to scrap because it's only 9,000 words. Like, it's not a very long project, and yet it took so much research and it took so much time and energy and meetings with my advisor to like figure out how to properly explain what I wanted to get done in my project and be able to achieve that. So yes, okay, I hope that this has been interesting to you, finding out like what kind of projects I'm going to be working on for my university degree for the next 2 months. My final deadline is on the 13th of May. My dissertation deadline is on the 1st of May. The two of my deadlines are in April before my dissertation, and then I've got some exams, but I'm not fussed about them for now because they're going to be in late May. But yeah, that's kind of what's been on my mind, and that's kind of been the stuff that's stressing me out. But to be honest, now that I'm feeling a lot better, I can say that like, although these are stressful things, the fact that they're going to be assessed, the fact that this is going to determine what the grade I get at the end of my course, I am really lucky to be studying philosophy. I am really lucky that I get to write my final papers on interesting subjects that I actually want to write on and that I'm actually excited to research. And yeah, that's it. So yeah, let me know what kind of essays you're working on, if you're working on essays, or what kind of projects that you're researching at the moment. I would love to hear about them in the comments. And also, just to leave you with a final note, because this video's gone on for long enough, I really want to participate in Escape Roll. I don't know if you've heard of it, but Savannah Brown has this like online community project of writing a poem every day in April, and I really want to do that. But as you can tell, based on this video, like, I've got so much other work to do in April that I don't know if I'm going to be able to do that. But hopefully I will manage to write at least a few poems in the month of April and maybe share them on this channel. So if that would be interesting to you, please stick around. Yes, okay, thank you very much. I will see you later. I love you guys, and I hope you're all doing wonderfully. Bye.